Welcome back. Last volume we saw Rosamine get her metaphorical legs kicked out from under her with Ferdinand's engagement to Detlind announced. And then as summer drew to a close, Georgine visited Ehrenfest to stir up trouble and then leave abruptly, all while making her schemes pretty plain to see. So what awaits us in this volume? Well, as fall draws to a close, Rosamine's impending third year at the Royal Academy looms. It's not even a full season. What could happen, right? Well, before you dive on in, perhaps hit the subscribe button. There should be like an animation playing around here. That helps you stay up to date with Bookworm content from me. I also have merch for sale, so if you're interested in that, check out the card in the upper right hand corner. And with my obligatory plugs out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the last volume of part 4. The prologue begins from Florencia's perspective. It's right after Georgine leaves and she's struck with just how worrying her smile was. The last time Georgine gave that smile was to Veronica in the Ivory Tower, as we saw in a side story back in part 3, which if you'll also recall, there was a hell of a mess left in her wake, with Wilfried entering said Ivory Tower and Rosamine being poisoned. Events all spurred on by her sycophants after her visit. Rosamine asks Sylvester about the summons they received, and it came from the border gate. Sylvester even read it himself, which is extra weird, honestly. Obs have a magic tool that lets them communicate with each other directly. If Ob Arnsbach didn't use that, then Ferdinand's intel is most likely right. And as he suspected, the Ob would collapse during their engagement period and force things to move along a lot faster. They break into a meeting room where Sylvester wants everyone to drop their information on him. Too bad Georgine was hard to get a beat on since her socializing was kinda shallow this visit. Most of the people in her faction left for home before she even did. But they did still get some intel. She talked about how every other duchy views Sylvester as a cruel archduke, learned about printing, and assumes all their new trends are from Ferdinand. A bombshell is dropped though, that apparently Arnsbach plans to return Ferdinand after their duchy is stabilized. They only want him for his mana and administrative skills, not him as an actual husband for an archduchess. Now that won't exactly happen soon, but just when Ferdinand goes to mention something, he catches himself. Rosamine pulls what he means out of him, and he's not exactly happy to say it, but he doesn't think he'll be alive by the time they send him back. Yeah, that's a pretty downer note to end the meeting on. And they end it after Florencia breaks the tension. Though she's still not satisfied, she wanted to talk to her kids before that meeting, but didn't get the chance. She tries to schedule a tea party with the 3 older kids, but Rosamine has to peace off back to the temple for more handover work, and Wilfried is immersed in his Archduke studies under Sylvester. Yeah, he's gonna have to help cover when Ferdinand leaves, since they can't exactly rely on Bonifacius forever. But hey, Charlotte's free. She's shocked when she hears that Wilfried says he earned the Lies Gang support. She corrects that misunderstanding. He didn't earn their support, they just won't openly oppose him. The bar is low for Wilfried in general, so as long as he doesn't make any mistakes, everyone says it was a success. They move on to Detlind, where Charlotte flat out says she's like Veronica. We see a nice moment here where Florencia asks if she means she's a spoiled brat, and Charlotte does a very noble response by simply sipping her tea without denying it. Classy as fuck. It's annoying Rosamine bailed on her socializing with Detlind, but Charlotte thought it was best to avoid conflict. She and Ferdinand are close, and Detlind's insults would just cause problems, though that exact closeness is now being seen as problematic. For both of them. That needs to change, since Rosamine is engaged to Wilfried and Ferdinand is engaged to Detlind. Rosamine's gonna need to rely on Wilfried more, and Florencia thinks that just means they need to spend more time together and socialize, but Charlotte actually disagrees. Wilfried can't be that pillar of support for Rosamine. Yeah, despite her needing socializing experience, her life's getting turned upside down right now and the temple would collapse without her. All this first wife training? Yeah, that can wait until she's an adult. Wilfried's the one who needs help at the moment, as his retainers are using Veronica's methods and demanding she and Rosamine offer up her achievements to Wilfried as tribute. It's gotten so bad, Charlotte doesn't want to support her brother anymore. And an even bigger problem, he's too dense to even notice the problem. She thinks they need to swap out his retainers again. And Florencia comments that since he's older, they don't exactly need to worry about his fragile boyhood anymore. Hell, even stick some Lies Gangs in there to give him a dose of reality. Though Florencia does see that as a bad idea with the planned winter purge. Giving the Lies Gangs more power? Probably not right now. She thanks Charlotte for her insight and is left to worry about all the crap on the horizon. A lot just dropped in this prologue. Charlotte's circumstances look pretty bleak. She's being denied a future as the Archduchess, forced to support her brother whose retainers keep forcing work onto her, all so he can take credit for it, mind you. And then she has to just grin and bear all this bullshit? It's not really fair. It makes her a pretty tragic figure, but also one of the more beloved characters in the Archducal family. People like Charlotte. It also helps things take a bit of a positive turn for her later on in part 5, but also we got the winter purge hinted at here. We're gonna hear more about that as this volume goes on, but it doesn't look good. Back to Rosemine's perspective, she's at the temple studying and taking a more active role leading the Blue Priests. Hartmut is by her side the whole time, dealing with his antics. He's overseeing the ceremonies with her now, but as the Harvest Festival approaches, he's stuck with his own mistake. He learned all that tax work only to have to go on his own without Rosemine now because he's a Blue Priest. That sucks. But while deciding what priest to send where, Rosemine realizes just how much hard work Hartmut has been putting in for her sake, learning tax work and to take over for Ferdinand. Honestly, he deserves some kind of reward. But what exactly? After speaking with her other retainers for a bit, they tell her he would most likely just want her to rely on him more. That's not really a reward, just adding to his workload. But honestly, there's not much else she could do. He wants to help her make magic circles and tools as her head scholar because he's not really doing the sort of work required of one at the moment. That's pretty frustrating for him. The only other thing she could think of that would be a suitable reward is allowing him to learn about blessings and the divine instruments. So when she sees him next, she offers to let him try and make them as she does. She explains he needs to offer his mana, and soon the magic circles on them will appear in his head naturally. But now the other archnoble retainers want in on this too. Cornelius specifically wants to make a Weegaleep sword. That'd be fine, but that kinda ruins Hartmut's reward, doesn't it? So now she asks the man in question what he wants specifically, and he says to rely on him more. Didn't we already go over that? He doesn't really do much scholar work outside the academy, and now that he's graduated, he wants to help her make stuff. So she agrees, despite this just making his life harder for him. But hey, he's happy, so what's it matter? So what are they gonna make first? Actually, she has a thought. She wants to make protective charms for Ferdinand and his retainers before they go to Arnsbach. With that, Hartmut helps her brew the charms, and her other retainers start offering mana to the divine instruments. She's not going to complain since it helps with their mana shortage, but what we are seeing is a huge change in her retainers at this point. Now they're not just cool with going to the temple, but also taking on blue robe work? We all know this story by now, so yeah, it's going to affect things later on, but this is them dipping their toes into religious ceremonies. During her trip to pick up the Gutenbergs during the Harvest Festival, she speaks with Guy Bleisgang where he offers some interesting information. The previous Guy was home during Georgine's visit, because he's too old to socialize like a normal noble. But because of that, he gathered some info that Georgine visited Gerlach on her way to Arnsbach. I mean, that's not super unusual since her carriages needed a place to rest and Gerlach is on good terms with her. But the issue is she personally visited, and a strange meeting apparently took place. He's basing this on the fact that many nobles left the city before Georgine's departure. So yeah, it's pretty much hearsay, which is why they didn't report it to the Archduke. But since she's there, they thought they should let her know. After that, she hears that Leisgang got printing started, and things are gonna work out, which is good. When she gets back to the temple, she lets Ferdinand know what she heard, and he decides to go mobilize Eustace to gather intelligence so they can figure out exactly what happened. Now that she's back at the temple, she holds a meeting with the merchants for reports, and to hear how things went over summer. Leisgang's printing industry proceeded well, though it does kinda frustrate Lutz they're not super interested in all the profits they can make. Hell, they're even selling some of their wood to Ilgner to research for paper making instead of doing it themselves. The outside merchants behaved this year due to last year's incident, and according to Benno, Karin is heading home with a Klausenberg merchant because her father is in hot water due to him causing them to lose business slots. Gustav teases him about how beneficial the marriage could have been, but Benno uses Rosemine's honor as a shield to deflect. It would have reflected poorly on her and Ehrenfest if a marriage could be shoved through like that. That Lynn's hairpin order is apparently an issue, not because Otto's craftswomen can't make it, but because she ordered one nicer than Adolfina's, which could honestly get Ehrenfest some rude comments for complying, and surely Detlind would be scolded fiercely for trying to outdo royalty. Luckily, Brunhilde was there to oversee this and suggested using multiple hairpins instead. That way she could add or subtract some to appear nice, rather than trying to get one that's better than a royal's. That suggestion went over well, but it would still cause problems if she tried to wear all of them, since she ordered 6. And this is where they can dodge blame by letting her parents have the final say. Like they probably will. More hairpin orders came through as Dunkelfelger ordered one for Lestalot's fiancé, Anastasius ordered another one for Eglantine. Apparently Lestalot's was actually a challenge, since it had a flower not found in Ehrenfest. But luckily it came with a detailed illustration, so Tully had a lot of fun working on it. From there, Rosemine moves on to Frida and tells her that she's planning to visit the Italian restaurant now that the busy season is over. That way they can hold a farewell meal for Ferdinand. After the meeting wraps up, she sends an ordinance off to him to confirm the date, but he's pretty swamped with handover work. That is until she says it's a farewell gift, and He remarks that's a good opportunity, so 10 days later, they're going. She's really pushing the bounds of what's acceptable at this point. They're both engaged to different people, and Rosemine's entering her 3rd year in the academy. Basically, she's staring down adulthood and still acting like a child, which just so happens to send some very mixed signals to everyone there that she's in love with Ferdinand. And yeah, that's gonna escalate as this ordeal plays out. Well, with that settled, it comes down to her retainers. They all want to go, but she's not letting them because they're either underage or too high of status to eat without attendance themselves, meaning they would have to come as customers. That was meant to be a joke, but Hartmut and Cornelius jump on it. Great. Well, Leonore includes herself, sidestepping the whole Guardians issue since Cornelius is going to be her escort, and Brunhilde's going to ask her father so she can learn more about the lower city to improve Groschel. Well, there's the Archnobles. How will the Med Nobles fare? Lysaletta is tagging along to better understand her lady and keep an eye on Angelica, who's guarding her with Damiel as usual. Felina, seeing that she's about to be left out, throws out there that Rosemine's her guardian and just asks for permission to go, which just so happens to work for Roderick too. Oh great, so that literally just leaves Judith. Well, might as well just ask on her behalf so she can get permission. Yeah, her little farewell present to Ferdinand just became a massive meal for all of her retainers to thank them for their hard work. On the day of, Ferdinand is a bit surprised at the massive group, but just decides to go with it because why not? At the meal itself, it's quite the spread. The double consommé gets high praise from Ferdinand again. Hell, the rest of the Archnobles are just as impressed. Lasagna is the main dish where Roderick and Judith both burn their mouths in their haste, causing everyone to laugh. That makes Ferdinand note how lively the meal is. Usually eating was just a necessary evil for him to get through his day because Veronica usually messed with his dishes, so they either tasted awful and looked fine, or were just flat out poisoned. Rosamund says she would have killed the bitch, but Ferdinand tells her the situation would have certainly ended up reversed had she tried at the height of Veronica's power, though Eckhart does like her attitude. Good thing they didn't meet until Veronica was out of the picture, am I right? Cornelius tries to express his sympathy for Ferdinand, but he isn't escaping unscathed either, because he's gonna have the unfortunate duty of restraining Rosamund, Hartmut, and Clarissa when she arrives. That sucks. After dessert, it's just the nobles there to speak, and this is where the real gift-giving begins. Rosamund presents Ferdinand with a small bag tied with a ribbon. That's not how gifts are usually presented in this world. They're supposed to be given in a wooden box, but Ferdinand accepts it and finds it contains a rainbow face stone with a complex charm brewed inside it. That's gonna protect him in Arnsbach. He's pretty impressed with her skills, but Hartmut helped quite a bit, so she can't just go and claim all the credit. That's when Ferdinand presents her with one of his own. He pulls out a metal hair stick with 5 rainbow face stones dangling from the tip. Yeah, each one contains a charm as well. While hers was just a raw face stone, he turned his into an accessory with quite a bit of style. Damn, he really can pick out a gift for a woman when he tries. He's also gonna need an excuse to avoid being blamed for Detlin's monstrosity. So, this is working double time here. As I already said, this misunderstanding keeps growing. That level of present normally would have been considered a marriage proposal. So yeah, Ferdinand's not really helping that much either. Brunhilde inserts it, and the idea is that she can use different sorts of hairpins to cover it up. That'll avoid it being obvious it contains a bunch of charms. Though, that's also assuming the rainbow face stones don't draw too much attention on their own. And spoiler alert, they will. She wants a compliment, and Ferdinand just says it doesn't look bad, so she's kinda mad he can't just say it looks cute on her. Hartmut then extols some poetry that perfectly encapsulates this scene, and that makes it pretty damn awkward. Cornelius comments how overprotective Ferdinand is with all these charms, and he calls him a fool. He's leaving for Arnsbach, and after everything that's happened in her first 2 years in the academy, she needs all the protection she can get, and it falls to her retainers to live up to that standard now. But don't get him wrong, he didn't give these because he anticipated the trouble that actually happened. He was anticipating assassins from Arnsbach in the first place. But this next year, he drops the bombshell that she's not returning for the dedication ritual since they all feel bad for her. Particularly, he warns her retainers to expect a lot of ire from the duchies they've passed, and also not to approach the greater duchies of the sovereignty. They can't be seen as opposing them, especially since they're already suspicious in the first place. Whatever she does, they can't go on the offensive. But if this wasn't bad enough, suddenly Ferdinand gets even more serious and swears all of her retainers to secrecy. Their biggest concern this year isn't from other duchies at the academy, but from the former Veronica faction children. Roderick clenches his fists and asks for confirmation if they're doing it that winter while the kids are away, and Ferdinand says they are. It doesn't really need said here, and for once Rosamund can actually pick up on the context. Yeah, they're gonna eliminate the former Veronica faction once and for all. So did they finally find some evidence for this purge? Yeah, they did, and it's kinda weak. Damiel found some last book. I glossed over this last volume, and that was intentional, but while helping Bonifacius during the Archduke conference, Daniel kind of uncovered some embezzlement. That was supposed to be brought up to Ferdinand and Sylvester, and as we see, it was. The reason I skimmed it though is because it's really just a justification for the purge. The real evidence actually comes in this book, so ultimately it doesn't really add to much. And honestly, the biggest nail in the coffin was last volume's epilogue, so understand by the end of this, it's gonna be a pebble on top of the pile. This is the ultimatum for Rosemine. Get them to swear their names to her by the end of the school year, or else they're going to be purged when they return home for guilt by association. If we recall back in volume 5 of this part, Ferdinand encouraged her to get the children from the former Veronica faction on her side as soon as possible. Now this purge wasn't a thing at that point in the story, but he knew it was just a matter of time before they took action against the Veronica faction, since they targeted the Archducal family multiple times now. It's only because Rosemine's been doing so well with those kids that they even have a chance to give their names in the academy. Usually they would just have been killed, but this is gonna finally squash whatever rebellious factions remain in Ehrenfest. Hartmut cries out that he wishes he hadn't graduated just yet. He's expecting this year to be awesome, but Ferdinand tells him there's work to do back in Ehrenfest for Rosemine's sake, so don't get too jealous. And with that, the meal comes to a close, and they head back to the temple. They quickly sort out that when the time comes for him to move, the snow could probably prove a bit of a problem, so she offers up Lessie, and Ferdinand accepts to let her move some of his key luggage, though most is going to be brought after his marriage and he's given proper chambers. But once they get to the gate, Rosemine notices something's up. The guards are all relieved that Rosemine and Ferdinand are back, and when they get to her chambers, Nicola informs them that Egmont had an attendant ask Wilma about getting a new attendant for himself. That makes Rosemine think he knocked up another shrine maiden, but apparently he's actually looking for a priest to help with the paperwork he's getting. Seems kind of odd, and wasn't he already scolded for going above Ferdinand's head last time? Whatever. When they open up her chambers that were locked up since she and most of her attendants were at the Italian restaurant, she catches a brief whiff of perfume. Now she dismisses that as her imagination, but something's just not sitting right. Clearly it feels like somebody was in her chambers. Fran then asks Nicola if she went into his room while he was out, but she didn't. Strange, she also smelled perfume. Okay, that's quite a few coincidences back to back adding up to a bigger picture. Let's go ahead and play detective for a bit, shall we? She has Zom inform Ferdinand while Daniel sends word to resummon the guards that went back to the castle. So yeah, her chambers suddenly got busy real quick. Ferdinand asks her what's up, but she says it's strange. Nothing's actually missing. Just, the vibes are off, right? That is until Wilma asks to be let in. The guards seemed worried at the gate, and this is surely about that. When Wilma enters, she's clearly nervous around so many noble men, but she does inform Rosemine that the gate guards that afternoon suddenly vanished. Plus, the gate wasn't locked properly. Okay, so that pretty much settles it. There was a secret visitor at the temple while they were away. Yeah, Ferdinand is suspicious now as well, and mentions if not for that report, Rosemine probably would have forgotten about it in a few days. Likely, there was a noble with them who assumed they could just make some gray priests vanish without anyone noticing. She's getting pissed now. She has Angelica and Daniel split up to inform the gates that she's looking for a carriage leaving the city that's stolen to her chambers. She has Wilma tell Gil to inform the merchants and see if they heard anything weird. Felina goes with her to talk to the Grey Robes because they were involved. And Hartmut uses his position as the future high priest to go talk to the Blue Robes and gather their stories. So with that, the remaining people there are going to investigate her chambers to see what plot's unfolding. Zom points out that the only thing of value in Fran's chambers would have been his keys. While he goes to fetch them, Ferdinand explains that Rosemine can search for the unseen evidence left behind. By spreading her mana in a thin, wide range like a veil, she should be able to detect foreign mana that doesn't belong to her. Before people get too excited, this isn't the same thing as mana sensing and is honestly a pretty high level technique. Most nobles wouldn't be able to do it. It has a very specific use, when you're looking for traps and when you have time to actually look for traps. Cornelius comments that's a novel idea, but most people wouldn't really need to check for magic tools like that. But Ferdinand has his reasons, as we already know. So Rosemine gives it a shot and she can feel her retainer's mana resisting hers, but strangely she isn't getting much resistance from Ferdinand. That probably has zero deeper meaning, don't look into it. When Fran does return though, she feels some resistance from the box, specifically from the Bible key and the Bible itself on the shelf. Yeah, if she was pissed before, she's about ready to hold a bloody carnival now. She tries to go look for the Bible, but Ferdinand hits her with some reality. While the technique he just showed her is useful for investigations, it'd be absolutely useless searching the whole city, and even she doesn't have that much mana. She'd get resistance from the whole Nobles Quarter, the Ivory Buildings themselves, but her own mana would be invisible. so not really useful for finding something stolen. But then again, why would somebody steal the Bible in the first place? Sure, there's a special with the whole king-seeking magic circle, darkness prayer, and Haldenzel miracle stuff, but if they're really that interested in a Bible, most nobles would just pay a blue robe to transcribe a copy for them, and a lot of the stuff that she's worried about isn't exactly public knowledge. Plus, stealing it would require her permission to read it in the first place, with re-registering making them unable to read the parts of interest. Yeah, no sense. Hell, they even left a replacement, right? Unfortunately not. Ferdinand tells her it's likely a fake. Still, that means they left her a new book. Now she wants to read it, but Ferdinand stops her again. This is likely a trap from any angle you look at it, honestly. If it's a replacement Bible, they could be accused of stealing it, and if it's a fake one, it would make them look bad if word got out. But before she even tries to touch it to verify, Ferdinand verbally and physically slaps her hand away. This could be an assassination attempt for all they know. So Eckhart springs into action, cutting up a fruit he keeps in his belt, and splashes the juice onto the book's cover. What the hell? That's a book he's ruining. Or not. The juice suddenly turns blood red and both Ferdinand and Eckhart glare at it. Turns out it's a rare poison gathered around Ehrenfest and Arnsbach's border. This can seep through the skin, and if Rosamund hadn't noticed, both she and Hartmut would have died at the coming-of-age ceremony. Eckhart and Eustace clear the poison away with practiced hands, while explaining it's a retainer's job to test for this sort of attack. Cornelius is stunned and thinks it's an attendant's job to test for poison, not a guard knight's. But Eckhart won't let him off that easy. He needs to pay attention and defend his lady from every threat. She's going to be a target, and with Ferdinand leaving, they're all she has. As Cornelius lacks Angelica's speed and no shits given attitude to spring into action, he needs to learn to use his head to protect Rosamund. Wow, really hitting him where it hurts. Cornelius is feeling pretty damn self-conscious at this point in the story, as we'll see later, mostly that he doesn't have a specialty like her other knights. Leonore's smart, Judith took sharpshooter as a feat, Damiel has experience, Angelica is fast, but what does Cornelius have? I mean, he has the most mana and he's an all-arounder, but what does he really have to call his own? So Eckhart scolding him here is pretty much rubbing salt in the wound. With the Bible clear, Eckhart hands it to Ferdinand, and he confirms it's a magic tool that mimics appearances. Yeah, it's not a real Bible or even a book. If she tried to take it to a ceremony, she would have been made a fool of and probably led to accusations that she lost their Bible, which isn't untrue, eventually being removed as the High Bishop and possibly disowned. Rosamund's so pissed she starts to lose control of her mana, shocking her retainers, but Ferdinand tells them not to get dazed. They should already know she gets emotional over books and they need to learn to cope. That's when Felina bursts in and says there's something wrong with Conrad, and he'll only talk to Rosamund. They race down to his room in the orphanage, and he's terrified. Apparently earlier that day, he wasn't feeling well, and went to his room to rest. That's when he noticed something out the window and saw a carriage pull up. Suddenly the guards are found with light from a stop, and thrown inside with a mean woman doing it all. He begs Rosamund to save them, and she says she will, though she asks Felina to stay with Conrad and calm him down. In the dining hall, she tells Ferdinand what she heard, and he's pretty surprised. It would have been a lot easier to just kill the Grey Robes, but Eustace suggests that maybe they want to get info on printing, since the former Veronica faction was kept out of that business, and that's a pretty good guess. They need to make a quick rescue here, and completely under wraps, or else the priests, and thus their only lead, could all be killed like any devouring soldier. Back in Rosamund's room, they hear that a shrine maiden was told by one of the gate guards a noble was coming who hated Grey Robes, so try to avoid her. The guard apparently used to serve under Shiksa, and since he was familiar with this woman, that pretty much narrows it down. Yeah, it was Viscountess Daldorf. Shiksa's mom finally re-enters the story to take her revenge. Only took 2 parts. Just then, Damiel and Angelica arrive with their reports. With what they gathered from the gate guards, the temple gate was abandoned and caused nobles to turn to the north gate shortly after they left for the restaurant, and the south gate had a suspicious carriage come through, with somebody who clearly served nobles based on their manner of speech, but there was a loud thud in the carriage, and that's when they flashed a ring with a noble crest and told them all to stand back. That happened fairly recently, so hey, they have a lead. Rosamund, her guards, and Ferdinand all take to the sky by Hybeast to track it down. They can't use commoner testimony to hold a noble to account, so they actually need some solid evidence, and that's why Ferdinand is going. And since they're just looking for some Grey Robe priests, that's not really reason enough to mobilize the Knight's Order, which serves 2 purposes here. That keeps their missing Bible under wraps too. Leonore, Roderick, and Felina are staying behind in her chambers. Leonore to guard those 2, but also to rein in Hartmut if he gets too out of control. Now Cornelius points out that the exploding, devouring soldiers could be a bit of a problem, since, you know, they need them as evidence. But Ferdinand says the best way to avoid that is to just cut the ring from their body before they explode. That way they could search their memories if it came down to it. In the air, Judith asks Rosamund if she has any idea where they might be going. But her best bet is they're probably avoiding winter mansions, because most of the commoners have already left the smaller settlements. That way they can avoid prying eyes. Just then, they spot a carriage following behind a wagon at a crossroad. The carriage seems kind of impatient, and when the wagon goes one way, the carriage hauls ass in the other. They follow after it, and Judith takes the first shot. That signals Angelica to cut the horses loose from it, so it comes to a stop. Eckhart and Cornelius cut open the door and find some priests being held at knife point by devouring soldiers. The priests are crying and pleading, but Damiel doesn't hesitate. He stabs the priest right through the stomach and throwing the soldier outside of the carriage by his throat. Damn, that's brutal. But he quickly points out that he knows every single priest's face in the orphanage, and these men don't belong to the temple. Yeah, now that he mentions it, Rosamund didn't recognize them either, and when he tries to plead for his life using the priest as leverage, she says she already knows where they are. Where at? Yeah, it was in the wagon. Why? Because that commoner farmer in that wagon wasn't heading towards a winter mansion, and she knows that because there isn't one in that direction. She traveled all over the central district. She knows this shit. She races off with her guards in close pursuit, while Eckhart and Eustace interrogate the devouring soldier still left alive. When they catch up, it's pretty much a repeat of the last attack, but the commoner at the reins is way more panicked, and says he didn't know he was getting involved in all this when he took the ring. They ask him who he's working for, and right as he's about to answer, he suddenly erupts in gold thorns that explode into flames. Whoa, what the hell? Damn, he was apparently bound with some powerful contract magic. Yes, this is what happens when you violate magic contracts. Or at least can happen depending on the terms. Personally, I doubt this would have happened with Benno had mine enforced the contract terms back in part 1. That seems a bit extreme. But as far as Benno and pretty much every other merchant knows, yes, you can get killed by not following a magic contract. And we see it here. And just so we're clear, it doesn't really seem to be a common occurrence. This was Damiel's first time seeing it happen. So, where are the priests at? In the back, covered by cloth. Damiel checks, but when the women try to get closer, he tells them they better not. Their robes were taken by the devouring soldiers in the carriage. So she sends an ordinance to Ferdinand saying they rescued the priests and to bring the clothes with him when he comes. But suddenly Judith remembers something fairly major, or maybe minor would be a better word choice, since she is one, and she's working outside the city currently, right? Isn't she gonna get in trouble? Well, no, because this officially didn't happen. Remember, when the robes arrive with Ferdinand, the priests thank her because they never thought she would actually come save them with knights. They also sent word back to the temple to let them know the priests are safe as well. But that's when an ordinance comes from Leonor asking her to hurry back and put a stop to Hartmut. Oh great. Wilma takes the priest back to the orphanage and Rosamund races off with Leonor and Ferdinand in tow, since his attendants are still with Hartmut. But Leonor is not going to explain because honestly, it's better if she sees for herself. They go to a random blue priest room and find him bound with light with Hartmut sitting on top of him. Oh, and Hartmut has a pleased smile on his face. Turns out this priest was bad-mouthing Rosamund in front of him, and he didn't take too kindly to that. In fact, many priests are being treated harshly. Now, while this seems rough, it was to prevent information from leaking as well, and Ferdinand does appreciate that aspect, but Hartmut's methods are simply too rough. All he had to do is confine the priest to Ferdinand's chambers and force them to do paperwork until the matter is settled. So when Ferdinand gives the priest the choice, and he obviously chooses paperwork, Hartmut chases after to force the rest to get to work. That's when Ferdinand picks up where he left off. There's 3 priests left to talk to, and they're all close to Sheik's family. But Rosamund hones in on one name in particular, Egmont, because he's caused her problems in the past. Specifically, with the bookroom, yeah, she's not letting that grudge go. But hey, they have to start somewhere, so why not with him? They arrive at his chambers and request an urgent meeting, and the attendant refuses their entry because there wasn't a meeting scheduled. But Ferdinand doesn't have the patience for this bullshit. He tells Eckhart and Cornelius to breach the door, and Eckhart doesn't hesitate. He slices it open and kicks it down, Ferdinand stepping inside saying he said it was urgent. And then we get a pretty gross picture of why Egmont didn't answer. Yeah, he's in the process of receiving flowers from the shrine maiden who took Lily's place. Pretty nasty. She covers herself up and Egmont is pissed, calling Rosamund a lowborn, which really pisses off her retainers. He yells that they'll rip her disguise off soon enough and points a finger, and that's when Rosamund notices a certain type of ring, specifically a face stone ring with a family crest on the same finger as a noble baptized child. She asks him about it, and Ferdinand immediately covers her eyes with his cape and slices the dude's arm clean off. I want to take a moment and point out just how much Rosamund's matured at this point in the story. Little details she's noticing that others missed, and situations that would have ruined her emotionally before, she's taking them in strides now. Yeah, this does bother her, but if this same situation happened in part 2, she would have been a shivering wreck. Let's face it, so she's definitely getting used to noble life by now. Yeah, the orders go out, and Eustace has to go grab the time-stopping magic tool in Rosemine's hidden room, while her guards take her back to her chambers so she doesn't see how nasty this gets. She talks with Roderick while Ferdinand cleans this mess up, and we learn that Gil put a pretty complete picture together for them. The Othmar Company confirmed when this ordeal began, but it turns out some guy serving nobles tried to eat at the Italian restaurant when they were there, and hung around after when refused. Apparently another tried to go to the Gilberta Company and buy the cloth that Rosemine uses. So yeah, they were clearly scoping out the lower city. Eustace arrives and asks Rosemine to help transport the tool and Egmont to the castle as discreetly as possible using LAKEY. She doesn't really have a problem doing so, but they're not going to the usual entrance. When she asks, Angelica answers this is where they take criminals. And awaiting them when they land is a ton of knights in Karstedt. He apologizes to Rosemine and says they'll get all the evidence they need. So with that, she goes back to the temple because this is likely just the beginning of this whole mess. There she meets Hartmut in Ferdinand's chambers where all the blue robes are working. Well, except the remaining two they hadn't gotten to yet. They could still be involved for all they know. She has him go speak to them while she babysits the blue robes. She explains this will be a common occurrence when Hartmut takes over as the high priest. So they better get used to working from now on. Though she realizes that many of these people will either be killed with their families or lose their status as blue robes without the support coming from them in the coming purge. That kinda makes her think. The students can be saved by offering their names, but what about the pre-baptism children? She considers if they can take them into the orphanage since they're gonna lose a ton of priests. Hell, that might offset the mana impact if they could. We're about to see a huge change in the temple from that simple line of reasoning. And all she has to do is get Sylvester on board. When Hartmut returns, they let the blue priests go back to their rooms, because it seems that none of them had anything to do with the infiltration. As her apprentices return home, Leonore tells Rosemine to be careful, but Cornelius isn't even sure what all they should be watching out for, since he didn't even notice how close she was to being poisoned. Yeah, Hartmut is suddenly about as icy as Ferdinand, asking for the details about that situation he missed, and then proceeds to bludgeon Cornelius, Damiel, and Stenluke with information about poisons and how to inspect for them. It's all information he learned from Eustace, so he's using the Bible key for demonstration purposes, but asks if they're 100% certain that it's fake, and honestly they're not. It seems too convincing to not be real, but it's also not registered with her mana, thus it might have been a trick to throw her off. Ferdinand didn't come back the next day, as he was investigating Egmont's memories, so Rosemine hears from the priests what happened on their end, and they confirm it was Viscountess Daldorf. Pretty much everything played out as we expected, so now they know who and how, but why? It's annoying she can't just charge in and go get the Bible back, but she's not so naive to even try at this point. Yeah, she knows by now that she has to let the evidence roll in. But hey, don't worry. It's not too long before Ferdinand arrives and has the evidence they need. Turns out Egmont's family contacted him to see when Ferdinand and Rosemine would be away, and a few days after he got that letter, he received notice they would be. He wasted no time in contacting his house. That's when they told him that Viscountess Daldorf would come to his chambers as the planting company. His house couldn't really refuse here, and Egmont didn't. Now he wasn't aware that the guards were kidnapped, but she gave Egmont some simple requests. Distract Rosemine's attendants and get into her chambers. So he did just that, using one of his attendants to slip through the servants' passages and unlock the door. While the attendant got the key, Daldorf stole the Bible and used a magic tool to replace it with a fake. The goal was to make Rosemine look like a fool at the coming of age ceremony and such. She then replaced the mana and the key with hers, hoping it would make them think it was fake as well. After word would have gotten out, the Viscountess assumed that Rosemine would have been removed from her post as High Bishop, and possibly even disowned. Ferdinand would face punishment too as her guardian. Egmont is pretty pleased with that outcome, since he got his pay cut after Bezewants died, and the Harvest Festival just isn't as fun. After that, they moved back to Egmont's chambers where Daldorf gave him a ring, signed a magic contract that said she would vouch for him to become the next High Bishop after Rosemine loses the role, and he stamped it in his blood, like a fucking idiot. She tells him that he has now officially become a noble, and he's stupid enough to believe her. She then left on her high beast with the Bible, and he assumed that victory was theirs, until Rosemine and Ferdinand burst into his chambers. So he signed a really beneficial contract with a noble, huh? Haven't we seen that somewhere before? Specifically in the temple? Ferdinand points out that the adoption contract that Dirk signed all those years ago with Bindewald and the one that Egmont signed with Daldorf are pretty much the same sort of deal. The contract Egmont signed was actually a submission contract. His ring is the same as the devouring soldiers, so he was likely going to be killed as soon as their business was done. The kicker, the crest on this ring belonged to Gerlach, so they finally secured the evidence they needed against him. Well, that works for her. Now they can race off and go get the book back from the Viscountess. But Ferdinand asks her where the hell is she going? Because he knows Rosamine all too well at this point, she probably doesn't have a plan. Though she does say the places that Viscountess Daldorf is likely to be, namely her winter mansion, and Ferdinand agrees to go as well. The estate is already being staked out by the Knight's Order, so they confirm that she's in there by herself. The rest of the family is at the summer mansion because Daldorf is by the southern border and it hasn't quite started snowing there yet. Now, does that mean she's limiting collateral damage or just doesn't want her family to interfere? Who knows? Rosamine isn't exactly waiting. She has Hartmut knock on the door and the head attendant is pretty surprised to see an Archduke candidate waiting on the other side, so she asks to see the lady of the house. But the attendant refuses, like any normal attendant would. However, no shit's given, she busts out her stop and binds the dude with light. They charge on in, and while she's not certain where the lady's room is specifically, all noble estates are set up pretty much the same way, so she can probably find her with an educated guess. As she heads up there, Ferdinand slips up behind her and says she should probably be in her high beast. That would protect her from mana attacks if you remember, but just then they hear a series of explosions above them and go running. Eckhart kicks down the door and Ferdinand tells her not to look, so she does as told, but asks what's on the other side. Daniel gives a very apt description of bloody stumps. Yeah, it turns out she blew up the head of her attendants and her own just to keep her memories from being searched. She didn't realize how bloody a bloody carnival actually is. Viscountess Daldorf left a note behind for Rosamine telling her to find the Bible if she can. And that's pretty much that. Yeah, this woman's grudge was so bad, she literally doomed her house over it. That was predicted back in part 2. But if she and Ferdinand can't find the Bible, they'll be disgraced, and Sylvester will lose face over having lost their one and only High Bishop's Bible. Though she probably didn't have much time to hide the Bible in the first place. It's likely still in the estate. While Ferdinand does the detective work, she requests an urgent meeting with Sylvester and he grants it. He clears the room as soon as they're both there. Yeah, this whole mess won't make their winter plans any easier by having to punish Daldorf's house beforehand. Word will definitely get out, and people will set up plans or put up a fight. So she asks if he's gonna execute all the Daldorfs for this. And he says of course. They stole the Bible and tried to assassinate his adopted daughter. Yeah, they're all gonna die. But she suggests using Schutzaria's shield to weed out any malcontents, and not waste life needlessly because that's why Jürgenschmidt is in its current predicament in the first place. Karstedt shakes his head at that. If they let the Daldorfs live, then all those killed by the guilt by association logic would have died needlessly. Which, given, is true, but that doesn't make it any less of a piss poor reason to keep doing it. Sylvester says that's a weak-ass punishment, and he's also not wrong. But also, Rosamine has a reason for suggesting it in the first place. Them fighting for survival will mean that they'll be motivated to help search for the Bible. Besides, if they find it, no crime really happened, right? They're already anticipating a massive mana and manpower shortage after the purge, so why not do a trial run on her methods with Daldorf? However, for this all to work, it needs to be done in secret. So Sylvester slips away from work with Karstedt and has Rosamine make her high beast. His would stand out way too much, being a three-headed lion, but he's just excited to finally be riding in hers, because, if you recall, this is his first time. However, since Judith is in there with him, he has to keep up his Archduke persona as much as possible. Sylvester might be an idiot, but he's a fun idiot. At the estate, the Geeb comes in with his son after receiving an urgent summons. Sylvester is in the parlor behind Rosamine's shield with her. The Geeb kneels and asks what this is about, and Sylvester lays it out for him. His wife stole into the temple, palmed the Bible, and tried to assassinate Rosamine in the process. The Geeb is in complete shock here, but his son that's with him yells at his father, saying that he told him that woman would doom their house over Sheik's worthless ass. Sylvester asks if he's the successor, and he was, now expecting they're going to be executed, but Sylvester tells him that there's hope yet, because the Saint of Ehrenfest has more compassion than he imagines. Rosamine steps in and says she wants her Bible back and doesn't want the whole family to suffer. The Viscountess has already paid the price. The only condition Sylvester has, they need to offer their names to him right now. That makes sense, I guess. It means absolute fealty, right? And the son, Jeremias, accepts, but his father can't. Not won't, he actually can't. The reason being he's already offered his name to another and can't get it back because it's in Veronica's possession. We're still not done with the Gabrielle lore dumps by this point, so Go ahead and get your notebooks out. You're gonna need them. Turns out Gabrielle made damn sure her daughter would have a power base of loyal retainers when she came of age, and had every single one of her retainers' children swear their name to her daughter. Now for some reason, Veronica did this same thing for Georgine, but not her precious little boy Sylvester. That seems kind of odd, right? Too bad we don't have an answer why yet. This is why the former Veronica faction hasn't switched their loyalties even after the tides of politics have shifted, as Med Nobles often do. It was their ultimate plan to form a shield to protect the Arnsbach line in Ehrenfest, but Jeremias didn't swear his name to Georgine or Veronica, right? Why's that? Turns out Guy Daldorf didn't make his son do so because Veronica's power was secured by the time he came of age. That means these nobles causing issues are all name sworn to Georgine, just as Viscountess Daldorf was. So Sylvester gives the Guy one last chance to find the Bible. Then he'll decide his fate from there. And get to work this dude does. He starts sending out ordinances to every Veronica faction loyal noble to figure out where his wife had been, who she had been in contact with, and what she'd been doing. While he's at that, Jeremias gets the details about the Bible's appearance. But even after the servants turn the estate upside down, they still can't find it. Ferdinand says it was most likely moved and asks if she had any teleportation circles, but she didn't, and wasn't even permitted to use the one in Daldorf. It takes the Archduke's permission to create one capable of moving people, and that can only be done within the duchy's borders. Between duchies though, that actually requires the king's permission. Ones that transport objects across duchy borders just require the two archdukes in question. They both got to give their permission, and that doesn't really happen that often, because usually generations down the line, some dispute pops up and it causes issues. So at the very least, it's gotta be an Ehrenfest. The head attendant then confirms that she didn't leave the estate after returning, and she had no meeting since, which they take to mean she disposed of the Bible before returning to the estate. But that doesn't leave any time from her departure from the temple and arriving home. Rosemine has one lead here. She remembers a servant bought cloth from the Gilberta company. The head attendant mentions that a merchant did indeed arrive before she returned, and that cloth was taken by an attendant to the castle, where it was placed with the wedding gifts for Ferdinand and Detlind. Why though? Doesn't that seem kinda stupid? We would just assume it would end up with Ferdinand, right? Well, gifts are sorted based on what they are, and likely the cloth would have been given to Detlind or Georgine when it arrived. So they have a possible answer, and race off to the castle where Ferdinand has one of his scholar retainers open the gift room for them. Holy shit, Ferdinand has other retainers. So they dig through the gifts and eventually find the cloth, and as it turns out, it was wrapped around her Bible. They test it for poisons and such, and when it comes back clear, she confirms it by its smell. Gross. But what was all this about? Wouldn't it seem like Ferdinand just stole it? Well, no. It would have seemed like Ehrenfest was framing Arnsbach for the crime. The worst part of this ordeal is they did crush the plot against them, sure, but ultimately they can't link it back to Georgine. Hell, Gerlach would have gotten away with it too, if they didn't find his ring on Egmont. The only real benefit was they secured enough evidence to justify the purge. The fall coming of age came and went without a hitch, though Rosemine didn't even open the Bible. That way she wouldn't give away any information that they recovered it. A letter from Egmont's family comes in asking how it all went down, and Ferdinand tells her to write back using Egmont's name. Just say that she brought the Bible and didn't attempt to open it. After that, it's time to head to the castle for the start of winter, and they're holding a meeting to sort out the purge. They're allowed one retainer of each field. So Hartmut, Cornelius, and Riarda. Sylvester explains their plan to the other two kids, who didn't know yet, and Wilfried is worried because a lot of his retainers are from that faction, so who really knows how many are name sworn? But how Sylvester's dealing with this situation makes a lot of sense, at least for Duchy's stability's sake. Those who swore their name to Veronica and weren't involved in any crimes, they're not going to be killed. She doesn't currently have her name-sworn face stones to give new orders with, so it's pretty harmless. Now they could actually go get those stones from her hidden room when she dies, but then the point would be moot by then. When the owner dies, those names bound by their mana also die with them. Those sworn to Georgine though, they're dead for sure. She's the first wife of another duchy, so they're executing those who are loyal to her over Ehrenfest. Now the kids at the academy should all be fine, honestly. They could enter Rosemine's shield last year, but Sylvester tells his children to secure the names of the kids at the academy to save their lives. But Rosemine does raise the question finally, what about the kids too young for the academy? Well, it turns out the Playroom group is going to get an explanation of the crimes their parents committed and given homes in the Night Storm. There they will essentially be given guardianship by the Archduke, allowed to attend the academy, and earn money once they become apprentices. If they have any surviving family members, they could be taken in by them, but that's not exactly likely due to how criminals are viewed in this society. Oh, and they'll all have to swear their names upon coming of age anyway. But Rosamund asks about the unbaptized ones. They're not recognized as nobles yet, and they have no clue how many there actually are, so basically Sylvester doesn't care about them. He's got bigger things to worry about. Rosamund asks if they could go to the orphanage though, prove themselves, and maybe be baptized under the Archduke's guardianship. And if they don't have a tool to survive, they could always become priests and support the duchy that way. Sylvester never really considered that, but honestly it sounds like a plan. Just take some of the money from their estates to support them, and they won't suffer a massive mana shortage after the purge. Ferdinand's honestly impressed by how thought out this is and commends her. But that brief moment's interrupted. An urgent message from Arnsbach just came from the border. Well, this doesn't sound good. After Sylvester finishes reading it, he's clearly not pleased. Ferdinand asks permission to read it since he assumes it involves him, and sure enough it does. Sylvester tells him they have 3 days to respond, and he'll leave how they answer to Ferdinand. When the meeting is over, Rosamund asks about it, and he has her come to his office where he can explain. Turns out it's from Ob Arnsbach, asking Ferdinand to depart at once if possible, because his health isn't good, and he wants to introduce Ferdinand to various nobles during winter socializing. Now they have the rare ability to decline here, but Ferdinand thinks it's for the best for him to go now. The handover is basically complete, and the purge is set to happen after the Lord of Winter hunt. Georgine is likely behind this summons, and he assumes it's to distance him from Ehrenfest as soon as possible for foiling her plans. Ferdinand wants to go now because otherwise Georgine could make it a nightmare for him to form connections in Arnsbach. Also, Det Lind won't be there to ruin things over winter. His main issue is, now this will require her to come back for the dedication ritual. That's when Hartmut steps in and says he'll handle it, and Ferdinand does not doubt that he'll accomplish that for his lady. After that, Ferdinand gets to work preparing his luggage, and Sylvester makes sure she helps him by having Riarda make sure he doesn't forget anything. We get a touching moment here where Riarda calls Ferdinand my boy, like she always has, but then she has to correct herself and call him Lord Ferdinand. The reason she called him my boy was because he wasn't married. And now that he is, she's following through on her promise. As soon as they're in the temple again, Ferdinand starts packing, while Rosamund prepares a ton of food for a time-stopping magic tool to ensure he eats well. That means Eustace is stuck tasting everything to make sure it's not poisoned, all before it's inventoried. She also asks Benno for an update on Ferdinand's bench. Okay. The next day though, she goes to his chambers to see what he needs help with, and Eckhart is sort of annoyed here. Ferdinand is locked in his hidden room, like usual, packing his stuff alone, and he wants Rosamund to get him to open it. So when she calls him inside, Eckhart tosses her in to help out to get Ferdinand to step outside more often. She tells Ferdinand she's prepared a ton of food for him, and also some sweets to reward Letizia when he's teaching her, but she's planning to send even more along with his bench in spring. But he just replies that she can go ahead and keep the bench. Why is he giving that to her of all things? Well, because she's losing hers. Hey, this is a nice callback to the furniture discussion when she lost access to her hidden room with the commoners. When Ferdinand steps outside, Rosamund's really hit with the fact that he won't be there anymore once he leaves. She'll lose her final pillar of support in this world, and that's pretty damn sad. She'd rather have him to depend on. Now, she wants to voice her desire for him to wait until spring, but she can't really bring herself to be that selfish, and instead suggests that he remove the restriction on his hidden room. That way Eckhart and his attendants can help pack. That sounds like a good idea, and he does just that, which essentially means she made her assistants obsolete. They even get a bunch of great priests from the orphanage to help out. But how is he going to make allies in Arnsbach when he's so prickly? Well, she's got a suggestion for that too. Winter socializing's gonna just be getting started, so why not hold an impromptu Harspiel concert to gain some easy allies? That worked pretty well back in part 3, right? She's already prepared new melodies for him to compose, a hairpin for Letizia as a gift, and educational materials as well. But he does have a job for her that's less annoying than offering unsolicited advice. Go fetch all of his books from the bookroom. She takes Fran, Zom, and Monica for that. There, she reminisces about the time she spent there reading Ferdinand's books, all while they're being packed, and they all share a chuckle at her expense. Her first time in the bookroom really stands out. When that's done, they head back to the High Priest chambers, and Ferdinand unregisters his mana from the hidden room. That means it's now available for Hartmut to register as his own. They pack up Lessie with the Great Priest's help, and as they're about to leave, Ferdinand's temple attendants gathered to see him off. They give him one final prayer of gratitude, which Ferdinand returns with a smile. That's when he gives his final order: support Rosamund as the High Bishop and treat Hartmut as they treated him. He then leaves Rosamund to Fran and Zom, showing that his trust in them hasn't faltered in the slightest. Yeah, the High Priest is the High Priest no more. So they head off to Ferdinand's estate to drop off his luggage. Inside, she notes that the people of Arnsbach might take a slight issue with him wearing a Dunkelfelger blue cape, and suggests he should switch over to an Ehrenfest one to be safe. He honestly forgot he was even wearing it still, but he does still need some protection. Well, good thing Rosemine's there and able to help. He tells her to use his workshop and make some ink, and she immediately picks up on what type. He wants her to draw the circles on his cape. How very scandalous. Asking a woman he's not engaged or related to embroider his cape. The reason is practical though. If they use his, then it would react to his mana. I mean, the charms will still work even if it's her ink, so why not? Plus, this is just a stopgap measure. He'll get an Arnsbach cape in spring after his Starbind. Damiel oversees the ink-making process since he remembers it, but now he's super frustrated that Ferdinand of all people beat him to the marriage punch. That's when Rosemine suggests that he marries Felina after her coming of age. You know, since she's a lay noble like him, she should also have enough mana to match his lower-end med noble amount. Seems pretty good on paper, but he shoots that down since Felina apparently asked Damiel for romantic advice. That was a bad move. It also led him to believe she has a thing for Roderick. He even recalls the note she got from him before he swore his name to Rosemine. Yeah, Damiel's an idiot, and Rosemine's not really paying that much attention, so she just decides to move on. When they finish, she gives the cape to Ferdinand, and he hands over his Dunkelfelger one. He can't exactly bring it to Arnsbach with him, so instead he suggests she take it to the Interduchy tournament so he can return it to Heisitza there. And a few days later, it's finally time. The Archducal family gathers as snow starts to fall. Her panda bus is also packed and ready. She hands over the charms to Eustace and Eckhart to protect them while they protect Ferdinand, though that doesn't really stop her worry despite Eckhart saying he would. Angelica tries to comfort her, and Eckhart and Angelica share a small moment over their devotion to their different charges. Rosemine tries to join in on their little fist bump, but it's denied because she's not a knight, so she tries to complain to Ferdinand, but instead he suggests they make a vow themselves. He kneels down to eye level, which is a bit surprising, and he says that he's going to Arnsbach to protect Ehrenfest, and he wants her to protect it from within. But he also knows her all too well, and her lust for books would definitely lead her astray. Thus, he presents her with a key. The key is to his estate. He's leaving all of his books, research ingredients, magic tools, and staff to her. He promised her a library all the way back in part 3, but that was for her mana to research. He can't really make good on that promise now, and is instead asking her to devote that mana to Ehrenfest for her new library's sake. He didn't really have to go and give her a library. She would have protected Ehrenfest no matter what. But this is Ferdinand's way of keeping her eye on the prize. Her man is starting to boil over at this point, and she can't really cry in front of all these people. She finally got her library, but at the cost of her closest companion, so she channels it all into a blessing instead. Unlike the one with her parents though, she busts out her stop and transforms it into a pen where she traces an omni-elemental magic circle. Everyone's shocked, but this isn't a magic circle learned in the academy. It's on the last page of the High Bishop's Bible, and its sole purpose is for praying. So she recites the gods' names as the circle lights up, and when it's fully charged, she showers Ferdinand, Eustace, Eckhart in a huge rainbow blessing, leaving all of those gathered speechless. Her only hope is this repays him for all that he's done for her. So Ferdinand smiles and says he entrusts Ehrenfest to her. This was a different sort of goodbye from the one at the end of part 2. Both hit really hard, but where the last one was filled with complete sadness, this one offers some hope and finality. That Rosemine's not just grown, she's showing her mentor, friend, and parent just how much. I like this scene a lot, because while it tugs at your heartstrings, it still makes you well up with a sense of pride in Rosemine. The epilogue picks up from Ferdinand's perspective. They're at the border gate to Arnsbach where Rosemine unloads his luggage. As he watches her bark out directions, he can't really help but feel sentimental about leaving after all this time. And that magic circle was a real beautiful send-off. As he's remembering it, he's struck with the realization that he won't really have time to research it, so might as well just forget about it for now. He's gonna be busy. Inside the gate itself, Letizia's there to welcome them of all people, which is pretty damn odd. Usually it would have been Detlind or Georgine, but she says that Georgine had taken ill apparently, and Detlind is busy preparing for the Royal Academy. Yeah, sounds like a scheme is afoot already. They step outside briefly and Letizia sees Rosemine's high beast being unloaded, which strikes her as weird but kind of interesting. Rideable high beasts haven't really caught on in Arnsbach, so yeah. That's when Ferdinand tells Rosemine to head inside and warm up. Even if she doesn't get sick as often, even a healthy person would catch a cold in this weather. That leaves Ferdinand and Sylvester alone for a second where they reminisce about their last meeting as brothers. Karstedt pulled Ferdinand into Sylvester's chambers where they drank some wine and finally laid it all out on the table. Sylvester's tore up that he couldn't protect his little brother, but Ferdinand brushed it all off. He gave his estate to become the chains to bind Rosemine to Ehrenfest, and his little hairpin gift did seem a little sussy, but it's not a necklace, so I guess it's fine. Not sure the cultural implications of that yet, though ideally Wilfried would have made it in his stead. Unfortunately, Ferdinand just didn't have time to instruct him how. Sylvester slips back into self-loathing mode, but tells his younger brother not to forget that Ehrenfest is his Geduld. And the flashback ends with Ferdinand saying he remembers his promise from that night, as well as all the other crazy stuff Sylvester did for him, accepting him as his brother, trying to protect him from Veronica, and even adopting a commoner. Sylvester is Ferdinand's only real family left in this world after his father died, and now they can't even treat each other as such because of this marriage. Yeah, this pretty much sucks. And Sylvester tells him to try and find some happiness in Arnsbach, rather than just focusing on Ehrenfest. Ferdinand then goes to check on Rosemine, where he finds her talking to Letizia. She's sharing a ton of warnings about Ferdinand and how to deal with his bullshit, but he notes that she appears taller than before. Now she might even be as tall as Letizia. Crazy stuff. He interjects saying his luggage is moved to the carriages, and he'll send letters through Raimund. Also that he's gonna keep his promise to her too. She steps to Wilfried's side, and Ferdinand notes he takes after his father in the right ways. He can trust Wilfried to look after Rosemine, so he bids farewell and leaves Ehrenfest for good. In the carriage, he's with Letizia and they chat a bit. There's not really much to talk about, but Rosemine's a topic they have in common. She asks what type of person she is, and Ferdinand turns it around on her, asking to hear her thoughts. Well, she has an impressive reputation, but speaking today, she realized Rosemine's a lot more approachable than she expected. She also gave her the hairpin from Ferdinand, which is kinda funny. That was meant to be a gift from him. He should have been the one to give it to her. So Ferdinand explains she's like family to him, but that just makes Letizia a bit sad. She doesn't really have family herself. Her blood parents are in another duchy, while her grandfather/adoptive father is about to die. That just leaves Georgine, who's emotionally unavailable and cruel, Detlind, who's a goddamn idiot, and Ferdinand, a guy she doesn't really know. So he reassures her that he'll see his duty through and train her to become a suitable Ob of Arnsbach. That sounds good and all, but what if Detlind doesn't want to give up the seat of Ob? That's a real concern. Well, then they only really need to speak to the king. Yeah, turns out Ferdinand's not really the type of person Detlind described to her, but if he commands enough respect from someone like Rosemine that she didn't want to see him go, she decides to believe in him. As they travel, they discuss his education plans for her, and he realizes he's gonna have to play Harspiel to win nobles over like Rosemine suggested. That sucks. But when they finally arrive in Arnsbach, Detlind's there to greet him. Just the sight of her makes him feel sick, but he remembers why he's doing this in the first place. The words he spoke to his late father on his deathbed come out of his mouth as he remembers, and Detlind mistakes them for being directed at her, so she's pretty pleased he understands his place. So there was a lot packed into that short amount of story. Because the Purge was introduced, a plot unfolded that could have spelled disaster for Rosemine, and Ferdinand's departure was bumped up, all while winter socializing and the new academy term are about to kick off. So how's this all gonna play out? Well, the side stories do a damn good job at bridging that gap. They're collectively known as the beginning of a winter apart. So let's get on into them because there's a lot to cover. First up is Irreplaceable from Sylvester's perspective. He's in his office getting work piled on him. But after one scholar tries to pass some over, he starts to tell him to hand it on over to Ferdinand, but remembers that Ferdinand left for Arnsbach. Yeah, there's a lot of work and a massive hole to fill. Well, they could call Bonifatius. He's retired, but with Ferdinand leaving, he agreed to take on a more active support role, especially in the education of the Archduke candidates. But it turns out that he's currently training the knights and can't really do paperwork right now. That sucks. But they're not going to stop him because he's actually accomplishing two things here. Actually training the knights, which is important, but the secondary effect is distracting the rank and file knights while Karstedt and the higher-ups in the Knights Order plan the Hunt and Winter Purge. So what are they going to do? How about Wilfried? He shows up real quick and they pile work on him, which he happily accepts because he's doing Archduke and training stuff now. Good for him. After Wilfried pieces out to go work, Sylvester reminisces about Ferdinand as a brother. From the moment they were introduced to one another, Sylvester took to the role of big brother with gusto. He showed Ferdinand around and tried to shield him from Veronica, but that never really stopped her. Even when he confronted her about it, Veronica simply said that he was a threat to Sylvester and needed to be eliminated. So Sylvester vowed to keep Veronica and him apart. But things changed when he entered his third year in the academy. Now Ferdinand was always coming first in class, but he still asked to stay in the academy outside winter. Veronica wasn't happy about that because it cost them money and tried to get him not to. But this is one of the few times his father stood up to her. Sylvester and Ferdinand saw each other less, but Ferdinand was a lot more lively at this point in his life, so he assumed things were going well. But that all changed when their father finally passed away. Sylvester found himself as the next Archduke, was busy with his wife and kids, and Ferdinand's engagement to a Dunkelfelger Archduke candidate fell apart. Also, Veronica's bullying turned psychotic at this point, and that didn't even change when he entered the temple. That night, Florencia comments how down Sylvester looks, and he can actually admit that here. Honestly, Rosemine's probably feeling it worse though, and Sylvester realizes just how great adopting her has been. She thawed his brother's icy heart and saved Wilfried, but now he's faced with that chilling hole his brother left, realizing he can't protect Rosemine just like he couldn't protect Ferdinand, so Florencia comforts him as he deals with the loss. Next is starting life in Arnsbach from Eustace's perspective. Simply said, they arrived too late. That means they won't have the chance to build connections like they wanted. Luckily, they managed to build some inroads with Letizia's retainers. We get some background here with Eustace and Georgine, where she apparently expected Eustace to take the scholar course to serve her, but then she found out that his information was imprecise and fairly useless, while taking personal offense to the fact he enrolled as an attendant rather than a scholar. Yeah, he can't serve her as an attendant. So, that was a non-starter. She said she would never trust him after that. That's fine, he didn't really want to serve her anyway, because of just how emotional she was under the surface. Now, she probably thought he wanted to serve Sylvester, but that was never an option either. He was deathly ill in his first few years of life before becoming the rascal we all know and love. But that does mean something rather unfortunate. They were the same age in the academy, and thus Georgine knows Eustace's tricks. So, no cross-dressing to infiltrate her chambers and gather intel. The one he chose to serve ended up being Ferdinand, who makes great use of his intelligence and gives him the freedom to pursue his interests. So, as we already know, Eustace thinks pretty highly of Ferdinand, though his circumstances are fairly ironic, as all of Veronica's constant attempts on his life molded Ferdinand into the perfectionist he is today. After serving tea, Eustace asked Sergius, the attendant who offered to serve Ferdinand in Arnsbach after going to school with him and respecting him quite a bit from that, to take him over to the kitchen. This is so he can share some information about their lord's preference, but in reality, this is to gather information. Arnsbach is being very careful, which we expected. Eustace isn't allowed out of Sergius's sight. Ferdinand is staying in some guest chambers, as is fairly normal since he's not married and can't use the obs chambers yet, but when will this starbind actually take place? Who knows? Detlin's gonna have to prioritize dyeing the foundation in her own colors, and the normal mixing of mana after marriage would probably make that a much harder task, so it's likely gonna be postponed until after the foundation is dyed. On the way to the kitchen, Eustace intentionally bumps into a servant and uses Rosemine as an excuse to ensure he gets new clothes. Since she's a saint who even values orphans, why not use her reputation to their advantage? But that does mean he got some key information, like where they get servants' clothes from. So after Sergius shows Eustace the kitchen, they head back to Ferdinand's room where he gets dirty after getting into a disguise. Eckhart then takes him to get a servant's uniform, and that's when he can pull off his grand information heist. When he gets back, Sergius asks where Eustace was, but he quickly makes up an excuse, that he was just brewing some potions and they probably missed each other. That's when Ferdinand asks Sergius to go start a bath, and hands Eustace a sound-blocking magic tool behind his back. He lays out the whole situation. Arnsbach pretty much hates Ehrenfest because they have a saint and they won't share their mana. The chalices Bezewants dumped on them in Mine's first year at the temple were actually from old Workstock. That area's been bleeding Arnsbach dry now. The first wife prioritized just about everything else besides Workstock, and since the second wife was from there, her faction hated the first wife a ton. They also severely underestimated Georgine's influence, as she absorbed the late second wife's faction after presenting those Workstock chalices. As it stands, the first wife's faction is behind Letizia, but they're faltering. This is on top of the general consensus being they don't need Letizia as an heir when Detlind exists. Apparently the king's order and the Ob's dying wish isn't common knowledge. After the winter kickoff feast, Ferdinand played Harspiel. He wooed pretty much every woman in the audience, and suddenly was swarmed. Detlind clings to him like a leech, using his popularity to boost herself up, but Ferdinand's playing and old school stories seem to do the trick, in giving him connections to nobles. Next is the start of a busy winter from Cornelius' perspective. We're at Ehrenfest's feast now, where he's busy glaring daggers at Geib Gerlach. Despite everyone trying their best, tensions are thick, and Sylvester has to keep things moving along while trying to ignore it. However, Leonor plays a good voice of reason by keeping Cornelius in check. Rosemine steps onto the stage to perform her duties as High Bishop, but now she's taking a more active role instead of just doing the blessings. She's actually reciting the Bible passages now, but she's not opening the Bible just yet. Leonor remarks how much their lady has changed since Ferdinand left, specifically how troubled she is. This brings up how much her relationship has changed with Ferdinand, where the subtext that went over their heads at the Italian restaurant is thrust into the audience's face. Everyone at that meal saw that charm exchange as a romantic gesture. Literally, if she actually looked her age, it would have straight up been seen as a proposal. Yeah, she's gotten charms before, but this one was certainly over the top, and definitely not like a guardian giving one to protect their charge. Cornelius wonders if Wilfried really has no issues with it, and apparently he doesn't. He just accepts it as his uncle being overprotective. Certainly once they get older though, he will, because as Leonore points out, one of the joys of a noble girl is having her charms given to her by her father slowly replaced by ones from her husband. That just makes Cornelius want to give her more charms. But she also understands why they need to protect her so much. After seeing that omni-elemental blessing Rosemine casually fired off, that's literally the stuff of legends, because noble wisdom would say life element would cause that to fail. That feat was enough to make everyone there pretty much a true believer, until Hartmut's enthusiasm killed any spiritual awakenings. Yeah, the academy is gonna be wild this year, and Cornelius won't be there to help out, so Leonore says she'll step up. Though now he's struck with that inferiority complex I mentioned earlier in the video, subconsciously comparing himself to Eckhart. But Leonore frames it better, by saying that he's conquered his weaknesses so that he's proficient in everything. The feast ended without much issue, and now it's time for the playroom. The Archduke candidates all take to their roles of leading the kids, except Charlotte, who's working with Florencia to house these kids afterwards. But Cornelius realizes how bad it's gonna get for them. Nicholas is gonna be going to the orphanage as well. Turns out his mother was Veronica's attendant and swore her name to her, but she's currently leaning more towards Georgine. Karstedt's estate has been a hotbed of gathering information for her, so she's likely gonna face a pretty harsh punishment, if not outright execution. But if Nicholas accepts the crimes of his mother, he would most likely be accepted in by Karstedt. Though to be fair, Cornelius still wouldn't trust him because who knows what nonsense she put into his head. From there, it's time for Rosemine to leave for the academy. She's leaving after Wilfried for once, because she's looking after all the books they're lending out to drum up interest. She bids everyone farewell and wishes them luck on their plans coming up. But she turns to her retainers and asks them to be extra careful, since they're not just involved in the Purge and Lord of Winterhunt, but they're also doing the dedication ritual as well. Hartmut will look after the temple to perfection, she gets a letter for Clarissa from him explaining his circumstances, and Sylvester tells her to avoid Hildebrand in the library until socializing starts. And she actually agrees. Why is that? Because she has magic tools to research with Hersher and Raimund for Ferdinand. After she leaves, Daniel runs through their plans, but Cornelius doesn't get why these people are so stuck on Georgine. That is until Hartmut frames it as if Rosemine went to another duchy. And yeah, that makes sense. But these people do have to be eliminated, since their loyalty borders on insanity. Yeah, Hartmut is self-aware of just how crazy he is. Next is Out of Time from Matthias's perspective. He's at the academy already hunting Fey Beasts with Lorenz. One damn near gets him while he's distracted, but they take it down nonetheless. The gathering spot has been fairly crazy since Rosemine performed the restoration ritual. That's all well and good, but the Fey Beasts are stronger now and proving a challenge, so they call it for the day. On the way back, Lorenz asks Matthias what's on his mind, and it's the whole name-swearing business back home. When Georgine visited, the parents of the former Veronica faction ordered their children to offer up their names to Georgine, but Lorenz and Matthias had a plan to avoid giving theirs. Basically, they'll say they're still growing their mana and can't provide accurate ingredients until they come of age. Nice dodge, and they bought it. Matthias was actually there when Georgine arrived at Gerlach. He hadn't sworn his name yet, so he wasn't allowed to attend the main meeting, but after dinner, he got summons from his father. Apparently, his honor student status and desire to compress his mana caught her attention, and she wanted to meet him firsthand. His first impression of Georgine was just how terrifying she was, and it's mentioned that her touch was like ice. Understand, Matthias is a pretty observant dude, so when he points out details, that usually becomes relevant later down the line. After the greetings, a few things really stand out about this little gathering. For one, it was summer and the fireplace was lit. That's pretty weird. But there's also this sweet smell in the air. But most of all was this dreamlike state that overtook the room as Georgine espoused how close she was to getting Ehrenfest's foundation. Everyone there rejoiced, and she said she needs good retainers when she becomes Ob. Matthias understands that owning the foundation is what makes one the Archduke. So Georgine's close to getting it. That leaves a big question mark in the air for Sylvester's family. It took everything Matthias had to keep his wits about him. As the atmosphere of that meeting became fanatical, he feared he was going to be swept along with it. The issue now is they could choose to offer their names up to the Archducal family or Georgine. They have that option until they come of age, and likely don't really have a choice. Serve the current Archducal family and learn Rosemine's mana compression method, or serve Georgine when she becomes Ob. The tables could be turned on Sylvester in an instant like he did with Veronica, so it's not really an easy choice. Matthias knows his father's cooking something up. Overfall, he was with him when he received an item through a teleportation circle. It was odd to Matthias because the item that came through was wrapped in a cloth similar in style to what Rosemine uses, and as soon as he received it, the Geeb sent out an ordinance telling whoever sent it, likely Viscountess Daldov, to get rid of her circle at once. He then sent another to Bettina after sending the package through yet another teleportation circle, instructing her to burn hers as soon as she receives the package. Then he does it himself, destroying the 2 circles. Matthias saw that as a massive waste because of how hard they are to make, but his father just says he needs to destroy what's no longer useful. And speaking of, he pulls out a face stone and kills one of his devouring soldiers right there. Now Bettina is Lorenz's sister-in-law, but he didn't know anything about the package because they moved out as soon as they got married. He does know that a few things were sent back to Arnsbach for winter preparations apparently though. So yeah, Matthias sees this scheme unfolding, and he's torn whether to tell Sylvester or not, because while it would make him indebted to them, they'd be screwed over if Georgine really does become Ob. Yeah, the current archducal family is very likely to be killed, except for maybe Wilfried. Georgine's too old to really take a husband at this point and have children ready by the time she passes, so yeah, Wilfried and Charlotte might be adopted by her. Rosemine on the other hand, she's a goner for sure, and that sucks, because Matthias and Lorenz like having Rosemine in charge. This choice isn't easy at all. When the Archduke candidates arrive though, they can sense something is up. Tension was thick during the feast, but right now in the dorm, it straight up feels like before the Better Grades Committee was established. Back when the former Veronica faction was being ostracized, Rosemine looks over at the Veronica faction children with a worried expression, while her retainers all have sharp glares. Yeah, something definitely happened. Immediately, Matthias assumes his father made an attempt on Sylvester's life, but based on how Rosemine's acting, maybe she was the target. That's when Lorenz says it appears they're out of time. They have to decide now. And Matthias asks if Lorenz wants to give surviving this nightmare a shot, and of course he does. So Matthias quickly approaches and immediately kneels. He plays the information up by saying he waited until the academy to give a report away from his parents' prying eyes. But before saying anything, he asks if they'll still be allowed to give their names and leave their families, and Rosemine says they'll accept any names given before the Interduchy tournament. So Matthias says he wishes to offer his to her, which makes Roderick incredibly pleased. In that moment, Matthias knew he made the right choice. He's leaving his family behind because he wants to serve Rosemine. When he looks back up, he tells them Georgine came to his estate during summer. Next is the new children from Wilma's perspective. It's after Rosemine left for the academy and Hartmut is in full preparation mode for not just the dedication ritual, but also the purge. He calls Wilma to his office to discuss something with her, and we learn that the children from the former Veronica faction will be coming to the temple sooner than expected. And it turns out the orphanage is ready, but these children will likely be extremely anxious having lost their family so suddenly. We get some insight that Wilma likes Hartmut quite a bit because he's shown nothing but kindness. He also doesn't lord his status over the priests and children, so basically the Grey Robes and children all admire him. He ends the discussion asking about a particular task he gave her, and unfortunately it's been put off due to just how busy Wilma is. That's understandable. He's pretty busy too, so it's fine if it has to wait. What is it though? He ordered 2 illustrations from her, one of Rosemine as an apprentice blue robe, and another more recent one as the High Bishop. Yeah, his obsession is that extreme that he's ordering pictures. Wilma leaves and Lothar, Ferdinand's former head attendant after Zahn was sent to Rosemine, accompanies her back to the orphanage. They talk about Hartmut, where we learn that Lothar foresees possible conflict. Where Ferdinand prioritized the temple, Hartmut prioritizes Rosemine. That's fine since those interests align currently, but Rosemine also brings a lot of change, so the temple is likely to change drastically in the coming years. But Wilma doesn't even consider that this change could be for the worse, because Rosemine is the saint of Ehrenfest. Funny, Hartmut said the same thing. These two really are on the same wavelength. In the orphanage, Wilma delegates some work to Delia and Lily, showing they're taking an active role as leaders there, and Wilma's already expecting some friction, because unlike Conrad, who chose to come to the temple, these former noble kids are being put there against their will. With that, Wilma retreats to her room to try and finish the paintings for Hartmut. The difference is pretty difficult to spot because Rosemine really hasn't grown much since her baptism, but the real giveaway is the maturity in her eyes. Though even Wilma notes she's hit a growth spurt as of late, and not even 10 days after the start of socializing, kids start getting filtered into the orphanage. 17 total, from toddlers to kids just before their baptism. The kids aren't exactly pleased to see Hartmut of all people, but he completely ignores their hatred with a bright smile and begins explaining how the orphanage works, using Dirk and Conrad as their buddies. so to speak, and he wants them to focus specifically on just how great Rosemine is. That way these kids can understand they owe her their lives. As Hartmut leaves, Dirk and Conrad get the kids started moving their stuff, but they're not budging. Hell, they finally have a target for their anger, but Wilma gets them to calm down by explaining the plan, that if they work hard and learn in the temple, they can become nobles still. One boy decides to put his magic tool down and get to work, not because he's given up, but because he wants to earn the Archduke's approval and become a noble. His name is Bertram, and we'll find out later this is Lorenza's little brother. He and Dirk immediately hit off a little rivalry, where Dirk wants to be his friend, but Bertram's just a brat. A few days later, it's not easy going as these kids are struggling, but that really means the orphanage is just understaffed though. And Hartmut's answer, without even being asked, is by bringing the former attendants of all the blue robes who lost their backing or are being questioned for their crimes by association. Turns out the attendants didn't want to be arrested with their lords. Who'd have seen that coming? Oh, and all the food from those blue priests was confiscated and brought down as well, so their food budget won't be affected either. Wilma is so moved by Hartmut's kindness, she fetches the finished paintings without a care and presents them to him, and as soon as he sees them, he's beyond pleased by the final result. Conrad and Dirk want to see too, and Hartmut lets them as long as they admire from a distance. And this is honestly a pretty good chance to show these new orphans the face of the girl who saved their lives. Hartmut launches into an impassioned speech about Rosemine's mercy, eventually recounting the massive blessing she gave to Ferdinand. Indeed, she's not merely a saint, but surely a goddess in the flesh. The kids all listen, and Hartmut then leads them in prayer, where he sticks a tiny addendum to the usual one, adding Rosemine's name onto the list of gods. Wilma's main takeaway here wasn't that she should correct Hartmut, but the kids will need proper instruction on praying. Next we have winter resolution from Camille's perspective. It's a winter morning and he and Gunther are out gathering peruse. On the way there though, the gate guards mention that some new faces are in the orphanage group, but Lutz and Gil were with them so they just let them through. It's probably Archduke business, so Gunther will ask him about it later. All Camille hears though is that the orphanage kids are in the forest. That means he's excited to go meet up with his buddies, Dirk and Conrad. They're friends because they just get Camille. They have toys in the orphanage, like he does. Which is pretty crazy, because Camille can't really talk about them to anyone in his neighborhood. Lutz told him not to. He apparently had an older sister named Mine who died years ago, and the nobles in the temple were involved, so the high bishop there gives them books and toys to make up for it. Camille actually remembers that one day when everyone was excited that Mine woke up, but he quickly realized she's not someone he's supposed to talk about. They meet up in the forest, and Gunther sends Camille to go gather with the orphans while he talks to Lutz. The new kid Bertram isn't super happy to gather, but Dirk quickly puts him in his place. They chat about wanting to play Karuta together, but they can't in the snow. However, Dirk and Conrad are confident in their abilities now that they have fresh competition. Camille won't lose though because he's even beat Renata, Otto and Karina's daughter. He flashbacks to his first meeting with her over spring. Thule took him there to introduce him and make sure he spoke politely. Benno and Mark were there as well, visiting and playing Karuta to help Renata's education. But when Camille beat her, she insisted he join the Gilberta company so she can win against him. After all, that's what work is, right? Playing Karuta all day? I mean, that sounds kinda fun. At least better than being a soldier like his dad. But Benno immediately tells him to join the planting company instead, since he likes books and toys more than clothes. Suddenly, this kid from the south side is getting offers to join the two biggest stores in the duchy, and they're actually fighting over him. Thule tells him not to worry though and think it over, which is what he's been doing. Lutz was listening by this point and chuckles at their stubbornness fighting over a kid. That's when he asks Lutz if he's gonna marry Thule, because he was a poor carpenter's son who's now a hard-working, fairly rich merchant and gets to leave the city. But him and Thule? Seems like they'd be a good match, but who knows? That's when Lutz distracts Camille by saying he's made up his mind about which store he's gonna join. Right? And he definitely has. He wants to work for the planting company. Lutz chuckles and mumbles something about Mine raising a bookworm, but Camille's just confused. Lutz tells him to study up now that winter's calming down, but Camille can already read and do math. What else does he need to study? But Lutz has been through all this before, and they're gonna have Camille come stay at the planting company for a few weeks to learn the ropes. He's got etiquette and stuff to learn. As they get more peruse, Camille notices that the new kids are slicing the peruse off the branches much quicker than everyone else. And that's not really fair. Camille tells Dirk that he might get to visit the workshop in spring if he joins the planting company, which makes them both pretty excited. At dinner that night, Camille tells his parents about his decision, that he's decided he wants to join the planting company. He kind of expected them to be upset, but quite the opposite. They're thrilled. Hell, F is tearing up that her son's goal is to make books, and we as the audience know the reason why is because he's following in his big sister's footsteps. Next is my son's departure from Riarda's perspective. This is a fairly sweet story about Riarda and Eustace's relationship. That he might be a disappointment that he divorced his wife, wasn't involved in his son's baptism, and put his lord and hobbies above everything else. But she still clearly loves him. As he's getting ready to leave for Arnsbach, Eustace asks her to help. Their relationship might be a bit antagonistic, but there's clear familial affection there. He needs her help packing because there's luggage he doesn't want the attendants seeing, but his blatant disregard for his mother's schedule is frustrating to say the least. But he's leaving all of his clothes and stuff to her while he packs up his hidden room, because he's planning to unregister it after he's done. That shows his resolve that he's not going to return, but also the fact he's not taking all that stuff with him hints at the danger they're expecting to face. While doing all that, Riarda reminisces on what led to this situation. Veronica had 2 daughters back to back, and it was putting her position as first wife in jeopardy. I mean, understand, she was just an archnoble after all, despite her high mana, and Georgine had vowed to become an archduchess for her mother's sake. But things suddenly changed when Sylvester was born. Because Veronica lost her mother and brother at a young age, she poured all of her love into Sylvester, which made her especially worried when they discovered just how sickly he was. Riarda was ordered to serve Sylvester since she accidentally became the most qualified person to raise potential archdukes, which means Georgine lost her head attendant pretty suddenly. If she had shown some resistance at the time, maybe this situation wouldn't have spiraled out of control like it currently has. Eustace tells her this isn't her fault, but the previous obs. Now she had ordered her kids to serve Georgine in her place, but Eustace clearly refused, as we already know. While Riarda regrets and pines for a different present where Sylvester and Georgine work together, Eustace is objectively staring at reality. Ferdinand would have been put in a lot worse of a spot if Georgine had stayed. I mean, who really cares? Georgine's a threat to the current Ob Ehrenfest. It seems Riarda tends to be conscious of the circumstances of her previous lords and ladies, but that's unique to her position of being from a branch family. The next day as she finishes, it really dawns on her that her disappointment of a son will soon be gone for good. She wants to say be careful, but it's pretty pointless too, because Eustace won't if his goals are on the line. So instead, she just reminds him not to forget his vow to serve Ferdinand. As Eustace smiles back, she realizes just how much she rubbed off on him with his dedication to his lord. Next, we have memories and farewells from Fran's perspective. After Ferdinand leaves the temple for the last time, the temple attendants just have to get back to work. With the incoming purge, they have to prep the orphanage in a way so it remains equal. They can't have these new kids coming in with better stuff than the actual blue robes. Camphor really comes to mind here because his house is far from wealthy. Turns out the Grey Robes actually respect him because he's nice and works hard, but Ferdinand had to talk to his house on more than a few occasions on his behalf. Hartmut's unlikely to do that, so they're a bit worried for him. Lothar is set to serve Hartmut, so Fran is going to have to share how to deal with Rosemine's retainers with him. But honestly, he's fairly laid back and rarely expresses dissatisfaction about his living situations. That brings up the struggles for the dedication ritual. Hartmut ordered to get robes for Cornelius, Angelica, and Daniel, but a Shrine Maiden's robes are a bit outside the new guy's purview, so they take him, his name is Ymir by the way, down to the storage to pick out something to suit Angelica, because all 3 of them just so happen to have builds similar to the nobles in question. Poor Ymir. We get some Ferdinand lore about his early days in the temple, where he originally had very little work to do. Remember, he didn't join as the High Priest. He took on that role after the previous one was sent to the sovereignty. He also didn't really eat meals in his chambers and only had 2 attendants. The reason why? Well, he was poisoned pretty often, and he didn't trust anyone but his estate chef. And for good reason too. Turns out Bezewants tried to poison him very early on. Unfortunately, Ferdinand saw through that with ease, and turned the table so Bezewants poisoned himself. Sucks to be him. His whole chambers were sick for about 3 days after that. Fran didn't know about this because he was serving Margaret at the time, and he didn't hear about it until now due to just how far the orphanage director's chambers were from the noble section. And that's when Lothar happens to hold up Margaret's robes to Ymir with a chuckle, telling him to try them on to see if they'll fit Angelica. Fran's not a fan for obvious reasons. Good thing Lothar's not dragging up this trauma on purpose, but most of this story is some nice quips and characters giving different perspectives on events that we've already seen. And at the end of it all, they're struck with sadness at the realization that Ferdinand's robes join those in the storage room. And not too far away in the future, Rosemine will be leaving as well. Such is the duty of a Grey Priest attendant, to be left behind when those they serve either leave the temple or die. But at the same time, the general consensus between them seems to be that there's nowhere else for them but the temple. In fact, leaving scares them. But Fran thinks to himself that if Rosamund wished for him to follow, he would leave for her sake. The end of this part feels so unlike the rest. Usually there's a time skip or a massive shift in our character's status that justifies such a transition. This time it's subtle. There's no massive time jump or upgrade for her. Instead, it's a sense of loneliness and liberation. Rosamund has to stand alone and face the world, because the remaining authority figures in her life can't contain her anymore. But before we get down that rabbit hole, which is gonna lead us into part 5, let's go ahead and finish up this volume with my final thoughts. This part really feels like the setup for the climax in part 5. We spent the first 12 books of this series getting a grasp on the characters in Ehrenfest, but part 4 gets us comfortable with the world and delves into the nuance of politics. There really is no good or bad in this story, because everyone's being selfish and each party acts in a certain way because they feel justified. Their actions make sense to them, and they can morally justify it in their own way. Why that's important is I think that makes this a very rich story, where you can look at pretty much every hero and villain and see them in the opposite light fairly easily. Veronica felt backed into a corner and used the power at her disposal to finally get the Lies gangs under control. The Lies gang suffered under Veronica, and now that Rosamund's there, they want to put her on the seat of Archduke to get rid of the Arnsbach blood. And that will continue on, which is why I think part 4 contains Rosamund's most impressive character growth to date, as she starts having to look at the country beyond her own little world. Because if she just acts with books in mind, she's gonna get exploited and possibly lead to people getting killed. I think what's fairly interesting is the side stories in this volume act as a bridge to the next part. Between parts 3 and 4, we got some backstory on what happened when Rosamund was asleep. However, these aren't just side stories, they're actual plot that becomes relevant in part 5. They're definitely things you'll be confused by if you didn't read them. But I think what stands out the most is it appears that Georgine's plot succeeded. We saw this in Matthias' side story, that despite their best efforts, she still receives something from Ehrenfest. Now we don't know exactly what that is yet, but we know for a fact it has something to do with Rosamund's mana as the Bible was stolen, unregistered from her, and Matthias mentions a cloth arriving with something wrapped in it that's being sent to Arnsbach. This is only a guess on my part, but it seems likely that it contains a face stone with Rosamund's mana, because the Bible was drained, and she would be registered to the Foundation of Ehrenfest. One might need someone registered to the Foundation's mana to gain access to it in the first place, and Georgine isn't anymore after she moved. Now, Rosamund was pretty much the perfect target, because she was relatively vulnerable in the temple with a source of mana free for the taking. So what does this really mean? Well, nothing good. They assume they thwarted Georgine's plot, only to miss the forest for the trees. Time and time again, Rosamund's mana is said to be valuable, and no one really questioned at the time where that mana went because they were too concerned with getting the Bible back to stop an interduchy incident. Probably because not many people outside of Georgine's faction know how badly she wants to be the Archduchess of Ehrenfest, even still to this day. This isn't over yet. The situation in Arnsbach is a lot worse than we thought. The whole point of Ferdinand leaving earlier was that he was going to make connections with nobles through the Archduke's influence. We know now that that's fallen apart, because the Ob passed away before Ferdinand arrived, so now he has to make those inroads himself. Luckily, he's very good at doing so because of his administrative skills. People are probably going to respect him once he starts working, but the situation in Arnsbach is a lot worse than they thought. And it definitely doesn't play into their favor either, as they massively underestimated the influence of certain factions, and severely overestimated how popular the king was, and widespread his decree is. From the information we had throughout part 4, it sounded like Georgine was installed as the first wife because the rest were eliminated, and who knows, the Alb is probably too old to find another. But then there was also hints that one needed skill to become a first wife in the first place. Being the only wife left doesn't necessarily make you the first wife. So how much of that was because the Ob's first and second wife died, and how much of that was Georgine's skill? Well, we pretty much got our answer in this volume. By leveraging the connections to her home duchy, she secured support from Old Workstock and the late second wife's faction after she was executed. Then she was able to play up sympathy that they turned cold to her, while exploiting the dislike of the first wife to create a power base that's made up of nobles sympathetic to the fallen duchies. On top of her raising Det Lyn to be incompetent so she has a useful puppet as time goes on, means she's pretty much secured a position inside of her own duchy. Holy shit, did she turn into Veronica? Kinda. So Ferdinand's plan to constrain her isn't likely gonna work out. These dynamics will be the backdrop to a lot of conflict going forward into part 5, as Arnsbach's poor political state spirals out of control. So Matthias telling the Archduke candidates what he saw at his father's estate basically was the death nail in the purge. With that and what they had learned from Guy Daldorf, they had plenty of evidence to justify a full-scale elimination of the former Veronica faction at this point. However, Matthias's intel was probably the most important, as the actions of Grousum indicated urgency. Now, he was already linked to the Bible being stolen, but now they knew that Georgine visited his estate with various nobles, he's name sworn to her, and he's still definitely plotting something. That all changed the purge from an after the Lord of Winterhunt thing to kill these people now thing before they do something dangerous. This is all indicated by the fact that the new orphans arrived in the temple. And again, this is something that's going to shape Ehrenfest politics for the foreseeable future. So this purge was not just a long time coming, but it's a major event. One that's not just wrapped up with a bunch of death. The real question then is, if the former Guide Gerlach was so clever and cautious, how did he leave such easily obtainable information that could have linked him to his crime, when he knew the Archduke was already suspicious of him? Hell, he was flat out questioned after Rosemine was poisoned in part 3, and he was so careful back then. Why did he slip up now? Those are valid questions with answers we won't get until a few volumes into part 5, but understand those weren't accidents, but all part of his plan to support Georgine. The Arnsbach bloodline has really created this whole mess in Ehrenfest, leading to all this strife and setting up the huge issues Rosemine will have to deal with in part 5. But it's in this volume we finally see the whole picture. Gabrielle forced a marriage in, was mistreated, and busted down to Archnoble despite her being an Archduke candidate from a greater duchy. She honestly should have been welcomed as the first wife to become a massive boon for Ehrenfest. That's how any other duchy would have treated this situation. However, she was ostracized by her husband and local nobles, forcing her to create her own faction. Due to not just hers, but her children's poor health, she created a culture that forced obedience by name-swearing to protect her dwindling family in the duchy. Her daughter then exacts revenge on the local nobles once she was married to the Archduke, by limiting their chalices, starving them of mana, then tearing them from positions of power so she can secure a future for her own children. That is until Sylvester comes along, and she devotes her all into her baby boy, creating a barely competent Archduke slacker who can't grasp that his mother failed to raise him properly, and it's impacting their political presence to this day. So going into her 3rd year, Rosemine's gonna have to navigate a political stage where she has to feign happiness for Ferdinand to ensure he's not being mistreated, and keep the royal family from making any more unreasonable demands, while also keeping up all the hard work that she and the students have done to present themselves as an upper-ranked duchy now that they've broken into the top 10. Lastly, I think it's also worth noting Rosemine's growth in this book. Not just physical, because pretty much everyone started to notice she's gotten taller. Hell, she finally looks like she should be attending the academy at this point. But her emotional and mental growth came a long way in the past few books. Just last year, she would have cried and begged Ferdinand to stay in Ehrenfest until spring. That's what he promised after all. But this volume, we see she's able to prioritize what's best for him in the future. She's finally able to swallow her emotions like a real noble and put them to use as mana. These are all things she couldn't have done even a few volumes ago, and with how things are playing out, she'll need that courage. We finally made it through the monster that is part 4, where Rosemine has to live as a noble without her childhood comfort. But what's on the horizon this coming school year? A purge back home devastating the local political landscape, an emotional roller coaster for her close friend and mentor, and now she needs to socialize for an entire season in the academy while also doing research that Ferdinand hinted at last year. It won't be easy, but we'll find out next time. Because our little gremlin's gone from the founding member of a library committee all the way up to an avatar of a goddess. Damn, that's a pretty big upgrade. For now though, hey, you've made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. You can also join my Discord with a link down in the description. If you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon and pick up some extra perks. And speaking of Patreon, I'd like to give a special thanks to JMon33A, Robin DBL, and Samuel Chen for their continued support. Thanks for watching.